The Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. Exploring the almost nuclear war. Cuban Missile Crisis, an extremely dangerous military and political confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War in 1962, considered the closest moment in human history to nuclear war. Although a long time has passed since this incident, there is still an important question that needs to be answered. Which country is ultimately responsible for this crisis that almost led to a world war? Is it the Soviet Union? Is it the USA? Or is it Cuba? Cut the chase before we dive deeper. It is indisputable that Soviet Union was to blame for the Cuban Missile Crisis, for trying to spread communism. Of course, we will provide the whole causes, key events, and the long-lasting impact to clearly explain why we got this answer. After World War II, USSR controlled the nations it had recaptured from the Germans. They wanted to spread communism in these countries. However, British, USA, and the other Europe countries worried that the Soviet Union would try to bring communism to their own countries as well. Moreover, USSR cut off all food supplies to the western part of the Berlin city controlled by the United States. Great Britain and France, since they don't like these countries to help Germany, this makes USA more worried about whether they will be attacked by USSR. In this situation, they create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This treaty is a military alliance between 29 nations in North America and Europe, promised to help each other if USSR attacked nations included in this treaty. Tensions grew with the Soviet Union as it expanded influence in Eastern Europe. In response, the USA adopted the policy of containment, formed new alliances, and reorganized its military and intelligence, laying the foundation of the Cold War. USSR must know what NATO is. They also understand what will happen if they are trying to threaten USA. In this situation, they still choose to put the missiles in Cuba and make the situation tense. While at the same time, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 happened, it was a remarkable military and political triumph, where Fidel Castro guerrilla forces, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, defeated the USA-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The revolution unfolded during the height of the Cold War, with Cuba becoming a flashpoint in USA-Soviet tensions. And the Cuban Missile Crisis almost directly followed this event. Because of this revolution, the United States regarded Cuba as a huge threat. Since Cuba is now communist, along with the Soviet Union, it is very easy for the Soviet Union to use Cuba against them. Not long after, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. In April 1961, in this tense atmosphere, the United States chose to launch an invasion of Cuba. Thus occurred the famous Bay of Pigs invasion, in an attempt to overthrow the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. The reason was that Castro was a communist and ally of the Soviet Union, so that the United States did not want to support it of its greatest enemy to be so close to its coast. But this invasion failed, with some invaders killed and others captured. The United States tried to use people who had escaped from Cuba to invade the Bay of Pigs, but they failed to destroy the plane there and disguised the invasion as a Cuban civil war. However, Castro realized that this invasion was caused by the United States, and thus developed a large number of soldiers to stop the invaders. Afterwards, relations between Cuba and the United States warmed further, but Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union grew closer. In 1962, Soviet mission to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba directly sparking the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev, fearing USA placing missiles in Turkey, convinced Fidel Castro to hold Soviet missiles. The Soviets used elaborate deception. The mission was condemned anathema. Troops were told to pack winter gear, and only 5 officers knew the full plan. Khrushchev later admitted, "We had to hide our tracks." The operation included R-12 and R-14 missiles, capable of striking most of the continental USA, and tactical FKR-1 missiles to counter potential invasions. Despite secrecy, US U-2 spy planes captured visual evidence of Russian missiles in Cuba on October 14, 1962, triggering the crisis. The presence of these missiles, as JFK warned, made invasion a very bloody fight. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the USA and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense 13 political and military standoff. On October 27, 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev proposes to John F. Kennedy a resolution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He offers to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the USA withdrawing its missile from Turkey. Khrushchev emphasizes the hypocrisy of USA concerns over Cuba, while American missiles threaten the USSR. You have placed destructive missile weapons, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally next to us. This is irreconcilable. After that, Khrushchev sends a long emotional letter to Kennedy, proposing that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles in exchange for a USA public pledge not to invade Cuba. On October 27, 1962, the crisis reaches its most dangerous point. AUS U-2 pilot Major Rudolf Anderson is shot down and killed over Cuba. On the same day, a second thwarted letter from Khrushchev arrives, adding the demand that USA missiles in Turkey be removed as well. In a secret meeting, Attorney General Robert Kennedy informs the Soviet Union ambassador that the USA has already planned to remove its missiles from Turkey, but this could not be part of a public deal. In this day, a Soviet submarine nearly launched a nuclear torpedo, with an officer named Vasily Arkhipov refusing to authorize its use, averting potential disaster. However, even if this crisis is resolved, the root cause of the crisis, the global dominance and military confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, has not ended. However, both sides still established some basic trust. Therefore, there was still a period of easing for a certain time. In 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This was considered the first time the two sides worked together to control the arms race, but still the Cuban Missile Crisis was a major setback for the Soviet Union because at the time it was far behind the United States in the number of nuclear weapons. Khrushchev therefore felt humiliated, so as soon as the crisis ended, the Soviet Union began a frantic military buildup campaign. We can see that, from beginning to end, this is an event caused by the expansion of Soviet communism. The United States deployed missiles in Turkey, and the Soviet Union's alliance with Cuba was caused by differences in political ideology. Not simply a missile crisis, the Soviet Union had many ways to prevent this crisis, such as negotiating with the United States or simply reducing its own aggressiveness and not taking actions like blocking food supplies routes. But the USSR don't want to stop. They choose not to withdraw missiles in Cuba because the missiles in Turkey. However, the fact is that the USA placed missiles they were only to prevent Russia from bringing communism to their countries. In fact, Turkey's enthusiasm for the USA deploying missiles there is far greater than the USA enthusiasm for providing them with missiles. From Turkey's perspective, deploying American missiles is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It can not only indirectly acquire nuclear weapons, but also enhance its marginalized status within NATO, strengthen its alliance with the United States, and use this to seek more economic and military aid. In other words, Turkey's missiles are not entirely Americans' problem. However, even if this crisis is resolved, the root cause of the crisis, the global dominance and military confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, has not ended. Subsequently, the United States and Russia began a new arms race, causing the core issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis to remain unresolved. Finally, after understanding all the information, we believe the audience who has read this far also has their own answers for who is to blame for the Cuban Missile Crisis. We firmly believe that it is the Soviet Union that caused this crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as a major event that affected the world order, profoundly helped us understand where the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union came from. The political propaganda of the Soviet Union became the root of this dispute. It is the end of the video. Thank you for watching.
Hello? General, how are you? Oh, fine. General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got, Friday night, got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba. We then got a message, a public one, the next morning, in which he said he would do that if we withdrew our missiles from Turkey. We then, as you know, issued a statement that we couldn't get into that deal. So we then got this message this morning. So we now have to wait to see how it unfolds, and there's a good deal of complexities to it.